Hello everyone, my name is Uwais Asmal and I'm the Head of Advisory at Outsourced CFO. Our topic for today is navigating the term sheet, and I'd like to introduce you to our expert for today, Sarah Lawrence, a legal consultant and advisor at Caveat Legal. Sarah, could you please give our delegates an introduction to your role and your experience?
Thanks so much, Uwais, and thanks for the opportunity to participate. It's lovely to be here. Yes, as Uwais has said, I'm a consultant on the Caveat Legal panel. I've got experience in commercial law, specifically mergers and acquisitions, private equity investments, and deals of that nature. And I've been in practice since 2010 now, so I've done a couple of deals.
You've got a bit of experience.
Yes.
Okay, no, that's great. So let's think about our delegates. As an entrepreneur going into an investment transaction, the first thing that an investor will give them is a term sheet. And for those who don't know or haven't done a deal yet, what is a term sheet?
A term sheet is essentially a summary of the basic terms of the deal that the entrepreneur would have been discussing with the investor to date. So usually, although the term sheet is the first physical document that the entrepreneur will receive from the investor, usually they've been chatting for a while already, and a lot of the terms of the deal would have been verbally thrashed out. And the purpose of the term sheet is effectively to consolidate the terms in writing, but at a fairly high level in a document. And although that document in itself is not sufficient to form the basis for the transaction in terms of a legal document, it will be used when it comes to the attorneys drafting the formal comprehensive agreements. So the content of a term sheet is quite important, because once you've settled that content, you'll go forward using that as the basis for the rest of the deal. And that's why getting to grips with the term sheet and making sure that it reflects the deal as both sides understand it is quite important.
Okay, so even though the term sheet is the first official legal item you get from an investor, there's a lot that happens before that.
Correct, yeah. And afterwards, yeah.
What are the key things to look for in term sheets for an entrepreneur to look out for?
So the most important thing when an entrepreneur receives a term sheet and starts to read it and come to grips with it is to make sure that it contains all the elements of the deal that you've been discussing with the investor to date, and that the elements that it does contain are a true reflection of what the entrepreneur understands the deal to be. Because, as I said earlier, it's going to inform the drafting of the comprehensive agreements later. So some of the key things that you'll typically see, or that you should definitely see in a term sheet, will be things like the amount of the proposed investment, the form that the investment will take, that's whether it's debt or whether it's equity, which I'll come to in a minute, and also the timing of the investment. Will all the money be injected upfront? Will you receive it in tranches over time? So those are the kind of things around the investment itself. If I just pause for a minute to talk about the form that the investment takes, so debt versus equity, investments will generally either come in by way of a loan to the company, which is debt, or they will come in by way of what people refer to as equity, in other words, where the money that comes in is used to acquire shares in the company. The main difference between equity and debt is that if the company takes on investment by way of debt, the debt is ultimately repayable to the investor. And there will be a number of terms that are attached to that debt. For example, the repayment terms, whether it earns interest, when interest is payable, what the interest rate is, and so on. And all of that needs to be reflected in the term sheet at quite a high level. But what the entrepreneur needs to be sure of is that what they've previously discussed with the investor is what is in that document. Another thing to look out for with debt is most investors will want security for the debt. So you'll be looking at things like personal suretyships from the entrepreneurs, possibly, or pledges of shares in the company, or if the company has got assets, whether it's physical assets like equipment or intangible assets like software or IP, the investor might want a pledge of the assets as security as well. So that's your debt investment. And then your equity investment, where the investor acquires shares in the company, is different, because the money that they put in for shares is not repayable. So once it's in, it's in. On the other hand, when they receive shares, they receive certain rights that attach to those shares. And usually those rights are economic, in the sense that if there's a profit, they'll be entitled to receive dividends. But also voting rights, so decision-making rights within the company. And, you know, there are a number of elements that go along with those. So those are your two forms of investment that the term sheet, it should distinguish between.
Okay,
then a couple of other, sorry, Wes, I just want to quickly finish up on that one. Another thing to look out for in the term sheet, which is linked to what I was just saying, is investor rights. Often investors will, whether they're investing by way of debt or by way of equity, they will want rights over and above what they would be entitled to just at a very basic level in law. And those rights could be things like decision-making powers at board level. They might want a seat on the board, for example. It could also be information rights, where they require the company to send monthly management accounts. They might require access at any time to the company's books of account, and maybe monthly updates with entrepreneurs to find out how the business is going. So those investor rights, you know, you need to look out for those in a term sheet as well. There's nothing wrong with them as long as the entrepreneurs are prepared to give the rights of that nature.
Okay. So you've mentioned it a bit briefly already, but what are the risks associated with signing a term sheet?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So term sheets, firstly, let me say, term sheets can go by a number of names. Sometimes they can be called a term sheet, a heads of agreement, a heads of terms, or a memorandum of agreement, even a memorandum of understanding. It's all the same document. The name isn't important. Some term sheets are legally binding, and it will say there that it's binding. Some of them are not binding, in which case it's more like a discussion document. And some of them, certain of the clauses will be binding and other clauses will be non-binding. But some of the risks associated with signing a term sheet, which is binding, is that if many term sheets will contain what's a clause around a break fee. So if the deal proceeds up to a certain point, and then for some reason it falls down as a result of you know, acts on the side of the entrepreneurs, the entrepreneurs or the company could become liable to pay what's known as a break fee, which is effectively a payment to compensate the investor for the time and the money that they've spent to date. So that's one of the key risks. It doesn't happen often that a break fee becomes payable, but it can happen. Another key risk with signing a term sheet is that, you know, when you sign that document, because it's going to form the basis of your comprehensive agreements later, you need to be sure as an entrepreneur that what it contains, as I've said before, is the deal as you understand it. If there are elements of it that you're not sure about or that don't seem right, you need to question them up front. Because if you get further down the line with the investor to the point where they've got their attorneys drafting the comprehensives, and then you come and say, oh, but we never agreed to this and we know that wasn't what we thought, etc., you can engender quite a lot of frustration on the side of the investor, and the tone of the deal can be negatively affected.
Beware what you sign, basically.
Beware what you sign, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And tell me, are there any risks that pop up in a South African context specifically?
Whereas the only risk that comes to mind in a South African context specifically is sometimes investors, particularly if they are smaller investors or less experienced, will try to transplant an investment structure from another jurisdiction, for example, from the States, into a South African context. And because our law is different, it doesn't always transplant as seamlessly as you might think. So what I've got in mind in particular are the so-called simple agreement for future equity, or a SAFE agreement, which is very common now and it's being bandied about all over the show. There's nothing wrong with a SAFE agreement, but as I say, because it's been transplanted from another jurisdiction, sometimes the long-term consequences of a SAFE are a lot more complex than people foresee at the outset. So although the SAFE initially looks very simple and straightforward, it's a short document and it's easy to understand, and you implement it on day one and that's fine, but then there are longer term consequences down the line, which are actually a lot more complex than you would have foreseen, or the typical entrepreneur would necessarily have foreseen. So my advice there, if you are presented with a SAFE agreement, there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing illegal or impossible to implement, but maybe consider taking advice as to what the long-term complications could be.
Sounds like you're talking about agreement that somebody pulls off Google potentially.
Some of them are, not all of them, but yeah, you need to be careful of those, yeah.
Moving on to my next question, what are the things that an entrepreneur should proactively add to the terms sheet before they finalize that with an investor?
Sure. So entrepreneurs, when you sit down and engage with the term sheet, during the build up to the point where the term sheet is actually presented to you, the investor will probably have promised you, aside from the monetary investment, they might have promised you a whole lot of other stuff. For example, strategic support, business development support. They've got experience in growing small businesses. They can help you with this and that and the next thing. If they've made those kind of promises to you and they're important to the entrepreneur, then make sure that those obligations are in the term sheet. They need to be there. Your obligations as an entrepreneur need to be there, and theirs need to be there as well. So that's quite important. Bear in mind what they've promised you and make sure that it's in the document. Other things that you need to make sure are there is that there should be a confidentiality clause, because you as the entrepreneur are going to be sharing information about your business with the investor, and it's your confidential intellectual property essentially, and they need to undertake that they're going to keep it confidential. So make sure that there's a confidentiality clause which binds not only the entrepreneurs but also the investor. And then finally, there might be what's known as an exclusivity clause or a non-circumvention clause. This is effectively a clause which says, for as long as you, the entrepreneurs, are negotiating with us, the investor, you're not going to go running to other investors to try and get similar funding. You must negotiate with us, and only if this falls through can you approach other people. There's nothing wrong with that. It's perfectly reasonable. But make sure that there's a time horizon to that clause, so that if the deal falls through, or if a certain amount of time has passed and nothing is happening, the entrepreneurs are released from that non-circumvention clause, and you can go and look for investments from other people.
Okay. And just my final question, what would your advice be to entrepreneurs who are looking to negotiate the term sheet?
I think my number one piece of advice would be, don't be scared to negotiate the terms. Don't be shy to negotiate with the investors. Make sure that when you read the term sheet, you understand every single clause in that document. If there is a clause that you're not clear on, that you're not fully, understand, get guidance either from an attorney of your own, or just go back to the investor and say, what does this clause mean? So that you can engage properly with the term sheet. And once you've got a full understanding of all the clauses, and there are things that you're not happy with, or you feel that it's not reflecting what you've discussed previously, don't be shy to go back to the investor and say, this isn't what we agreed. We'd like to change it to reflect the following, A, B, C. Having said that, and linked to that advice, is when you negotiate with the investor, although your business is extremely important to you as an entrepreneur, which is natural, avoid an emotional or a defensive or an entitled tone. If you're going to make comments in the document or during discussions, keep your tone professional, because investors will respect you more for engaging properly with the term sheet, but they will also respect you for having a professional approach. Which
sounds like small things that can make a big difference.
Yeah,
I would never, you wouldn't have thought about tone in an agreement, but that actually makes a lot of sense.
It
wow,
makes
okay.
a lot of sense. Yeah.
Thank you for answering. You've given me a lot of color, and I've learned quite a bit from all your questions. Basically, one of the things that also came out for me is there's no such thing as a gentleman's agreement. If you want to make sure everything you've agreed is in that term sheet. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you everybody else for tuning in. We'll be moving on to the next item. Thank you very much.
Hey, Lau here, one of the founders of Outsourced CFO. If you enjoyed this video, make it official. Click subscribe.